Richard just asked about whether localism can make a difference, and I want to expand upon that and give one local example. Right now, we have all of these problems with the MTA, and I never know quite how to think about it, because on the one hand, Governor Cuomo is saying it's almost a Trumpian, I alone can fix it, that he wants to take accountability for what happens with the subway and bus system, which is good because no one else has wanted to take accountability before. But on the other hand, his answer is to create a new panel of appointed experts to oversee the MTA board. So instead of fixing the existing bureaucracy, he wants to add a new layer of bureaucracy. And I'm just wondering, is this a valid approach? I mean, some people argue you can't fix these bureaucracies, you just have to ignore them. But that doesn't seem like a very good solution, because we're just going to be creating more bureaucracies that we're going to have to ignore.
Well, that's what Paul Leith, been standing in the back still, has written a lot about this. There is this tendency when things aren't working the way you want them to work, is you add a new layer. You say, this layer will now be in charge. And so he just seems to be falling into that same rut, except it's a layer of commissions instead of a layer of, deputy, associate, assistant attorney generals or whatever. Ultimately, I think clarity of authority in a democracy is really important, so people know who's making decisions, who should be accountable. And I think Cuomo's instinct is probably right that it's a tangle. If you really wanted to fix it, you would actually first say this will preempt all these other systems, and we're creating a new authority. Paul Romer didn't get to this, but one of what Paul Romer has written about is that when you have broken legacy, when you have legacy institutions, legacy bureaucracies, they develop their own culture as well as structure, and it's very hard to go in and fix them. You actually need to start a new one. And so when Dayton Hudson, a department store chain, wanted to create something that would compete with the big box stores, they didn't open a new branch of Dayton Hudson. They actually hired entirely new people in an entirely different place and said, create Target.
But I think what we've seen, at least I think, under, both parties in Washington for a long time now is presidential candidates who run against Washington, they arrive in Washington, and rather than actually deal with the bureaucracy that's there, they try to run the entire government out of the West Wing, right. Often with essentially with political people.
Right.
But, and usually they don't succeed all that well. But meanwhile, by the time they leave town, the permanent bureaucracy is still there. And that's where I think government is different than business, because right. Even if you're successful, if you come along and you create a completely new business and you're really good at it, the old business dies, it goes away.
Right.
But bureaucracy never goes away in Washington. So to some degree, it seems to me, to fix this on the federal level, you still need elected officials who are willing to not try to just circumvent the bureaucracy,
but take it on
right. Head on.
So Nicole has hit on the intersection of several of my personal interests, because in the supreme irony of my life as a libertarian columnist, I'm the child of a lobbyist, and specifically a lobbyist for New York City's infrastructure industry, now retired. And so I have lots of opinions on the New York City subway, but also on failing companies and failing bureaucracies. And so I would say a couple things, and the first is that, yes, it is a unique problem to government, not because these problems don't show up in companies. They absolutely do. My favorite example of this was I did temp work at a company that was, I would imagine, having some cost problems. So they had decided, everyone gets one pen, right? Because we're going to cut down on all of the rampant pen theft. So you have to bring back your old depleted pen to get a new pen. Well, as you can imagine, what then happened was that someone lost their pen. And then the next thing they did was steal someone else's pen. And soon the entire office was occupied in basically nothing but either stealing pens or defending their pens from other pen thieves. This is a completely counterproductive way to deal with it. But I assume that company is no longer with us. But if that were a a government agency, we would be in like year 25 of the Great Penn Roundtable, right? And so that's part of it. But there is a thing about federalism, and I think something that Cuomo is dealing with and something that we deal with. And I just wrote about this actually recently with regards to California's high-speed rail. One of the things that really afflicts federalism in the United States is like that it's overlapping, right? It's not a central authority that is down, it is then devolving some authority to another group with still, as Philip says, a line of accountability to the top where presumably, like Eisenhower, the buck stops here with the president, right? Instead, what you actually have is competing governments. And no one has any authority to resolve anything. And so you see this anywhere basically where the transit system crosses state lines. You see it in Washington where we have a completely totally dysfunctional basically DC, Virginia, Maryland. No one has final authority except Congress, who doesn't care. They can't fund anything. And, you know, as my husband recently said when we were talking about subway lines, they were like, you know, you can ride that line more days than not and it will not catch fire. I know you guys have similar problems here since I grew up here. But, you know, what Cuomo is trying to solve is that very small governments are subject to capture by special interests. Very large governments are much less subject to that, but then have this problem of like managing a very large institution is very difficult. America manages to neatly combine those two problems in one system, and so what you end up with is our 2.5 billion a mile tunneling costs and all the rest of it, because we combine all of that lobbying power of very small groups with the proceduralism of the feds. So my dad used to estimate that adding federal money to a project would add about 5 years to completion, because the compliance then sucks up more time and you need more consultants to do the compliance and all of this. And so, you know, I don't know how to fix that problem. It is somewhat weirdly unique to the American system because we don't merely have like devolved power. We actually have literally, the federal government just can't say no to a bunch of stuff. And the fact is that like most of the cities on the coasts have been very well captured by their special interests and will lobby to keep the 25 guys sitting in the tunnel doing nothing.